Students, in the last lecture I told you about the two types of data, that is primary data and secondary data, its advantages and disadvantages. Now in this class we will start with the various methods of collecting primary data. So let's see the first method, which is called the interview method. So as all of you know that interview involves asking questions and getting answers from someone. So in an interview there are two parties. The first party is called the interviewer. So in case of a research, the interviewer is the person who is doing the research or the researcher, okay? And the second party is called the interviewee. So this is the person whom the researcher is asking questions, okay? So in interview, two groups are involved. The first group is the interviewer, which is generally the researcher who is asking the questions for data collection, and the second is the interviewee, which is the respondent who is being asked the questions. Now these questions can be asked either orally or verbally, or in written case it can be asked in any form, okay? Now interviews can be done in two ways. The first way is a face-to-face interview, okay? And the second is a telephonic interview. So what happens in a face-to-face interview? In this, the interviewer and the interviewee will be sitting together in a face-to-face fashion, okay? And in a telephonic interview, the interview is carried on through phone. Now this can be audio call or there can also be a video call, okay? Like you can use Skype. Clear? So in interview method there are two parties involved called the interviewer and the interviewee. This interview can be done in face-to-face fashion or a telephonic fashion, and the questions are asked verbally or orally, okay? Now what are the advantages of a face-to-face interview? See, the first thing is you can ask detailed questions. So suppose you asked a person, what is your profession? And he replies in a single term that, okay, I am a teacher. But you want to know more. Then in case of a face-to-face interview, you can get a detailed answer of whatever you want to know. So it will provide a rich data. Secondly, the literacy conditions of the participant is not an issue. See, suppose a person is illiterate and he cannot read and write, but you can always ask him questions and he will be able to answer those questions. So with other methods of data collection like questionnaire, he might not be able to understand everything, but if you are doing an interview, you can be able to make the participant understand what you are asking, okay? So complex and unknown issues that the participant faces can be explained. Also, the response rate is higher. Why? Because the interviewer or the researcher is sitting himself and asking the question, so there is a greater chance that the person will answer the questions. Now what is the disadvantage then? The first disadvantage is that it is time consuming and expensive. So you will have to give time to every person, and also it is quite expensive. Also, training of the interviewer is very important. You have to do a proper training of the interviewer so that he can reduce the bias and use a proper method of interview, okay? Now coming to telephonic interview. Telephonic interview it will also give you data just like face-to-face interview, okay? Now what is the advantage? They are cheaper and faster because you don't have to go to all people to collect the data, okay? So they use less resources also, because you just need a phone call to get your answers for your questions. Okay, now if you have, similar to a face-to-face interview, if the person is facing some issue, you can always answer this. See, I'll tell you one more advantage of face-to-face interview. There are certain questions that can be answered through observation. So in case of face-to-face interview, you can always observe the person to get certain answers, but that is not possible in a telephonic interview. Okay, now what is the disadvantage? Sometimes the person may not respond to your call, so you have to make repeated calls. Okay, because in the first time the person might not answer, and suppose if you call back, then also there may be that they are not answering properly, because suppose I am asking them at a personal question which they cannot answer in the office, so they will not be able to answer that question properly. Okay, so if you are doing a very short survey, then only the telephonic interview is good, otherwise not. Also, for a telephonic interview, you need to know the telephone numbers, and you have to keep a list of the people whom you want to interview. And if you want to interview for a sensitive issue, then it is not a good idea to go for telephonic interview, because we do not know how the person who is being interviewed will react. Okay, now the interviews can be done in 3 ways. First, the interview can be a structured interview. Okay, otherwise it can be a semi-structured or a unstructured interview. Now see what happens in a structured interview. In this, the interviewer will ask the same set of questions to all the interviewees. He will not change the questions. Okay, also the questions are set prior to the interview is done, and generally a limited number of options are taken. Okay, so very less option for variation is given to the interviewee. So see, there are two types of questions. One is a open-ended question and one is a closed-ended question. What is the open-ended question? Suppose I say describe yourself. So you can use your words and describe any way you like. But if I ask you a question that are you hungry, you will say either yes or no. So the first question wherein you can describe things is a open-ended question, whereas the second option in which there are only a given possible choices is a closed-ended question. So in structured questions interviews, very few open-ended questions are there. It is generally closed-ended questions that are being asked in a structured interview. Okay, so the questioning is very standardized, and also there is a proper order in which the questions are asked. So the interviewer beforehand itself will set that which question has to be asked first and which have to be asked later, and the same order will be followed for all the participants who are being interviewed. Okay, see, also the interviewer obviously has to be friendly with the interviewee, but he will not insert his personal opinion in the interview. He will simply stick to the questions that he has framed beforehand, and he will wait for the respondents to answer for the questions. Okay, now coming to the second, which is a semi-structured interview. Now this is also a type of formal interview, and see, the interviewer may not set a proper sequence of question, but he keeps an interview guide. So based on this interview guide only, the interviewer will ask the questions. So there will be a list of questions and topics that the person wants to ask during the conversation. So interviewer will follow the guide, but it is not necessary that he will strictly follow this pattern or structure or order of the questions. He may deviate from that based upon the circumstances from person to person. Okay, now the third one is an unstructured interview. Now what happens in an unstructured interview is that there is a formal interview, no doubt. In all the cases, both the people know that okay, an interview is going on, and they will sit and speak with each other. Okay, in this case, the interviewer in mind knows that he has certain questions to ask, but there is no structured guide. So in first case, in a structured interview, there is a proper set of questions and order in which they are to be asked. In the second case, there is an interview guide that has to be followed. It may not be followed in the same order, but in the third case, the interviewer knows about the topic he is going to ask, but there is no structured guide or a set of questions. So what the interviewer will do, he will first build a rapport with the respondents, and then generally he will use open-ended questions so that the interviewee is able to express whatever the answer is in their own way. Okay, so there is very little control over what the participants are going to answer in a unstructured interview. Okay, now let's see what are the advantages and disadvantages of a interview method. See, the first advantage of an interview method is that you can ask in-depth questions. So in other ways of interview, of primary data collection, like making an observation or sending a questionnaire, you will be able to get answers, but if you want to dig into the details of that question, it is not possible. Only in case of a interview you will be able to properly dig in and collect all the information. Secondly, non-response is less because you yourself are going and collecting information from the people. Also, bias of the interviewer and the interviewee is less. Okay, what is bias? Personal judgment, that is less. Also, you can control the sample. What does it mean? Means you can control whom you want to interview and whom you don't want to interview, so you can get the right data and right sample for your research. Okay, now let's see what are the disadvantages of this method, that is interview method. The first point is that it is very time consuming because you will have to first structure your interview and then go to individual people for a face-to-face interview or call these people for a telephonic interview. So it is more time consuming. Also, it is expensive because more resources are required, like for calling, and also if you want to visit people, you have to go and personally ask the questions. Okay, and the third is that the interviewer might be biased. So suppose the interviewer wants to get a particular type of result for his research, so he might include only those people who will answer positively to his research. So in that way, the interviewer may get biased in case of an interview, but in questionnaire that is not possible, or observation that is not there. Clear? So interview is the first method of primary data collection, and it is one of the most popular methods also, because it will give you quite detailed information about your research. Okay, so in the next class I will be talking about the other methods of primary data collection. Thank you.